Now, a bit of history behind this fly. According to fellow tyer Don Wilson, this jumbo fly was a favorite of Esther Wallace, former owner of the Long Branch Saloon in Greenville, Maine. Now, Greenville Junction really started to grow around 1888 when the International Railway of Maine was built through the village. Scenery, hunting, and fishing was its main draw for tourism, and shortly after the construction of the railroad, several inns and hotels were built, including the Piscataquis Exchange Hotel and the Moosehead Inn. The Long Branch Saloon could be found on the ground floor of the Piscataquis Exchange Hotel. Unfortunately, the hotel suffered numerous fires, one in the early 50s, another in the early 60s, and the last one in 1978. The bar was located near the train station. The bar is described by Esther's son Travis as follows. The trains would go by at all hours of the day and night. Few guests ever forgot the sensation of bolting awake to the rumble of diesel locomotives, their whistles blaring urgently, light from their headlamps blazing against the wall. A wood fire roared in a red brick fireplace. A blue haze of cigarette smoke hung close to the ceiling. 2 quarter stacks lined the rails of both pool tables. The cigarette machine clunked with each pull of the lever. The front door opened and closed, opened and closed. People shouted, laughter boomed, bottles clanked, the telephone rang, boots clomped, billiard balls thwacked, chairs and bar stools squeaked and scraped against the plywood floor. And you'd hear the rockola playing, blasting songs like Take This Job and Shove It, and Lucille by Kenny Rogers, and the twang of whatever 1970s country record would be playing next. Hunting season was always the busiest time of year for both the hotel and the bar room. The Long Branch was voted Playboy magazine's roughest bar in the country multiple times. Now, I don't want to stray too far off topic here, but as I was scrolling through the Long Branch, I'm just going to make mention of a few posts that stood out to me. Now, the last thing you probably think when going through Greenville Junction is about World War II, but reading through some comments about Greenville, Charlotte Dickinson said, as a child in the early 1940s, Greenville, we village kids would sometimes ride our bikes over to the junction to watch the engines be turned around in the turntable. In the World War II years, we would ride our bikes over to the CP station to watch the troop train, sometimes with huge anti-aircraft guns and trucks on flat cars, as well as soldiers in the passenger cars. Then, also seen in those times, might be open trucks loaded with German prisoners headed for the Sabumuk POW camp. There are so many good stories, like Dave Holmbaum marrying his 4th wife, standing behind the bar right next to the Budweiser tap, or the night that Charlie Barrio, irritated at having been shut off by the bartender, fetched a chainsaw from his truck and attempted to cut down the cedar post that held up the ceiling and the 3 floors above it. Or even the time when Rolly Lizotte found himself being thrown out the front door only to be thrown back in a minute later, this time through a window. And if there are any locals listening from the Greenville Junction area, or just anybody who managed to swing into the Long Branch back in the day, we would love to hear a story or two from you down in the comments. And I'll leave you guys today with this postcard from Ted Williams to the Wallace family. Ted Williams, of course, one of the most famous baseball players from the Boston Red Sox. Ted got his interest in fishing in Maine in 1939 when he was interviewed by Bud Levitt, one of Maine's most famous sportscasters. He worked as a sportscaster for over 50 years and was also the host of one of the first outdoor shows on national television. Bud Levitt was sent to Fenway Park in 1939 to interview the Red Sox. When Ted Williams overheard that Bud was from Maine, he asked how the fishing was up north, and a lifelong friendship was born. I don't know if you guys could tell from the intro, but this is a very large fly. Here's a number 2 Carrie Stevens hook. Very large hook that I tie a lot of my streamers on. You can see it's about 2.5 inches. I often get comments about how large these are, but today we're going to 5 inches. Now you guys have probably seen me tie my tandem flies with a piece of 30-pound test monofilament. Now that works just fine for a 2.5 to 3 inch fly, but once you get to about 5 inches, it's really difficult to keep this monofilament straight. It just wants to keep that curve. So what I've found is a really good alternative to that is a piece of stainless steel wire about the same gauge as the monofilament. Now this piece here actually came out of a welding machine, so if you guys know somebody who welds, ask them to cut you off a couple feet. You can see that the stainless steel wire is just about the same thickness as the monofilament. Now the recommended hook for this fly is a size 4 Mustad 3399 or similar. Here I've got a size 2 Mustad 3366. I'm going to grab some white UTC thread in size 210. I'm going to start this behind the hook eye. The only difference is the 99s. They have a downturn hook eye, so you can slide your mono or wire through the hook eye and tie it in underneath the body. But it's not a big deal to just tie in your connecting wire on top or on bottom without running it through the hook eye. In fact, I have quite a few older flies in my collection from tyers like Bob Thorne, who used to tie like a treble in as the rear hook, and those didn't have downturned hook eyes, and they work great. Just going to put an even base of thread down on the hook shank here. Now I'm going to grab my steel wire. You can see that mine naturally has a bend on it from where it came out of the machine, coiled up. I want to keep this bend going downwards. I don't want it bending to the left or the right. Just want to keep this pointing down, and I'll straighten it out once I get it tied in. If the wire wants to go off to one side, I'll just give it a pinch here, flatten it out, make sure it's right on top. Everything seems good. Gotta watch my hand here. I'm making very wide loops. This wire is very long and right in my way, so just be mindful of that because you don't want to bump into it and bend it and jeopardize the integrity of the wire. So continue down the hook shank. Fairly nice even touching turns. Just gonna get behind the wire a little bit and take a few wraps so that it's not sharp and pointy right there. And you can see that the natural bend is still going downwards, it's not going off to the side. So I'm just going to come in and make a series of light bends, micro bends. You don't want to actually put a bend in this wire, guys. And let me take this out and show you. I've straightened it out pretty good, and I'll be able to straighten it out more as I get it tied into the front hook. So let me get this back in the vise. I'm going to grab my next material, and this is going to be some silver oval tinsel. I'm just going to tie this in as a rib. Now the original pattern called for an evenly wrapped white yarn body. I'm just going to use this 210 thread as a substitute for the white yarn. And once I've got my thread to the hook eye, it's time to wrap my oval tinsel. But I like to throw a 1/2 inch in to secure my work, so that's really the only way to tie this down here. So I'm gonna get out a lot of thread here, guys, a lot of thread, and I'm just gonna pinch my thumb on the hook eye here and take this loop through the stainless steel wire way up here, and then I'll slowly tighten it up. And once I've got my thread to the hook eye, I'll take some open spiral wraps here, get this oval tinsel up to the hook eye and bind it down. And now I'm going to throw in 2 of those wide half hitches and tie this off. There's one. And here's the last one. Tighten it up and snip it off. Now it's time to come in and seal those threads up with your favorite lacquer or head cement. So what I'm going to do is cover this whole fly body with 2 coats of Sally Hansen's, and that will kind of harden this thing in an enamel shell and increase its durability. And I'll take that out of the vise, and while it dries I will put in the front hook. For the front hook I'm just going to use the same hook, the same Mustad 3366. So I've got that in my vise. Now I'm going to come in again with the white 210 thread. I'm going to wrap a nice thread base down to the point of the hook here. And snip off that tag end. And you guys want to be mindful of what happens if you go too far down this bend, especially with these sprout hooks. Then your wire's going to want to just follow that bend down, and that's not how we want it. Now you want to make sure when you tie this in that it's straight on, not left or right, but straight on. And you can have this riding, you know, upside down or right side up. I'm going to have mine right side up. So I'm going to tie this in the length of the hook here. Some nice even turns. If that wire starts turning to one side of the hook on you, just keep leveling it out. Keep checking on it. And I'm pinching this front portion of the hook to keep the wire in line with the hook. And once I get near the hook eye, I'm just going to come back with my thread. Just building up a nice even base here because I'm going to wrap on some tinsel. Let's grab another piece of the silver oval tinsel, tie the butt end in, and advance my thread back up to the hook eye. Once I get to the hook eye, I'm going to throw a half hitch in to secure my work, and I'll start wrapping that tinsel. I'm going to take some open spiral wraps, get about 4 turns showing here, and I'll bind this down at the hook eye. Few turns in front and behind. Come in with my scissors, cut that end off. And now I'm going to throw in 2 more half hitches because I'm going to cut off this 210 thread. You can see I've tied this actually a little over 5 inches, it looks like. Definitely a large fly. I'm going to grab my Sally Hansen's and coat this front portion of the body. 2 coats of Sally Hansen's. Then we'll come back and finish this fly up. Alright, I'm going to start some white UTC thread here. Just going to get this on the hook shank. Snip off the tag end here. Now I'm going to tie in the throat of the fly, so I'm going to grab a dyed red bucktail. I'm going to use the shorter fibers from the tip of the tail. Originally this fly was tied with some red calf tail for the throat, but I don't have red calf tail, so I'm going to snip off a clump, thin it out here, and I'll tie it in. I'm going to set it on underneath the hook shank here, and take a few turns forward and then bring my thread back. And that looks pretty good. So now I'll come in with my scissors and I'll snip these butt ends of hair off. Alright guys, so now it's time to tie in this hair wing. This is a hair wing streamer. Here's where a lot of people might run into an issue. So I want to talk about materials for a second. Here is a bunch of different dyed bucktails that I've bought over the years. None of these are long enough. If you live in New England or somewhere where you have white-tailed deer, the tails from a white-tail buck, ideally you'll want to harvest the biggest deer possible to get the biggest tail. But you can see that this will work. It is long enough. It's the guard hairs. The majority of this clump of hair is shorter, but there are some longer guard hairs in there. So I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm going to snip as close to the skin as I can possibly get so I can maintain the length here. And I'll be snipping off a very large chunk, probably about the diameter of a quarter or so. This might seem excessive, but again, what we're after is those long guard hairs. The majority of these hairs in the clump are not long guard hairs. So you can see now I'm just thinning this out over and over again. And what I'm left with is the group of longer hairs that I was going after. And that looks a little better. Still a few short ones, but I think this will do. So I'm going to tie this in now. I'm going to take and make sure my thread is all the way back. And I'll take a few loose wraps over the top of this deer hair. And now I'll check to see how this is sitting. Looks to be setting okay. So I'm going to bring my thread back to where I started. And I'll grab my next color. The next color is going to be Silver Dr. Blue. Now if you're somebody who has a bucktail dyed Silver Dr. Blue that's actually long enough to complete this pattern, kudos to you. But I think the majority of people out there probably won't have that lying around. So one thing you can do is come in with a Sharpie, or better yet, a waterproof permanent marker. And you could just take the Sharpie and color a clump of hair light blue. Just keep in mind, if you do use a Sharpie, that it is not as permanent as the dyeing process, and you might lose your color over time. I'll just pry up these butt ends of hair and snip them off as close as I can get them. Now the final material for building this wing is going to be 4 to 6 strands of peacock herl. Now the peacock feather that you see in the background is a premium peacock feather. That just means that the fibers are a little longer, it's a little bit better quality. So I got about 5 strands of peacock herl here. I'm just going to set this on top, work my way down here, binding this in. And that is going to be the last material to build this wing in. Then I'll come up and I'll snip these butt ends. Now I'm going to take my thread, build up a fairly even head here. Oh man, and you know what? Actually, as I get looking at this pattern, I realize I misread something I had written down here. And I should have been doing this head in a black thread, not a white thread. Because I need to paint some eyes on with a white eyeball and a black pupil. No big deal, I'm just going to throw a few whip finishes in here. I'm going to grab my black thread. And very quickly I'm just going to wrap on a thread base of black here to color the head. I'm just trying to get all the white covered up here. And I'll come in and whip finish. And there, now I've got a black head. No problem. Next step is to grab my acrylic paint. I'm going to grab the white acrylic paint and my dowel that I use for making my eyes. I'm going to use the wide end of the dowel, dip it in the white paint, and make an eye. Make an eye on my side and one on the other. Now I'm just going to let this Now I'm going to wait for the paint to dry and I'll be back to put the pupil in. Alright, paint's dry. I'm going to grab my black paint, grab the fine end of my dowel, and put a black dot in the center of the white eyeball. And there you have it, looking like a bait fish. The last thing you're going to want to do is seal this head with some type of glue or lacquer. You guys know I like 2 coats of Sally Hansen's here. Put 1 coat on, let it dry. Now I'm back for the other coat, and beautiful. There you have it, guys. The finished Super Smelt. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. To see more content like this in the future, hit the subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. It really helps out my channel. That is it for today's video, guys. Catch you next time.